Okay, paper number 5 on cycling biomechanics will be our last in this series on the notion of optimal and preferred pedaling rates in cycling. Here in this paper, they use a different term for pedaling rate. They call it cadence, which is just another term you'll see in cycling or in locomotion research in general for the rate at which the cycles of the motion are being completed, whether it's the stride cycle in walking or the stroke cycle in swimming or whatever. Cadence is just another term you'll see used for that part of the gait cycle. So here cadence in cycling is referring to the same thing that we've been talking about in the previous few lectures on pedaling rate in cycling. So when you see cadence here, that's your RPMs, the rate at which you're completing cycles, or the pedaling rate that we referred to from previous studies. This is a paper by Umberger et al. Published in 2006. And here again, they were also tackling the question of what explains the pedaling rates that we observe people using in cycling, because it doesn't seem like it's necessarily the pedaling rate that minimizes metabolic energy expenditure. What you also see in those data for selected pedaling rates that people kind of preferentially use, if you just put them on a bike and say, hey, pedal at this power output, what pedaling rate do they subconsciously choose, is that on average, yeah, it's in the ballpark of like 90 RPMs for reasonably experienced, reasonably well-trained cyclists, but there's some spread around that. It's not like literally everyone uses 90 RPM. Some people might use 75, some people might use 105. It'll on average be around 90, but not everybody uses something terribly close to 90. And why is that? What factors might explain why somebody would prefer a slow pedaling rate versus somebody else preferring a fast pedaling rate? And what might explain why that's the case? Why do some people use different pedaling rates? And does this explain why we tend to not observe lots of people pedaling at the rate that absolutely minimizes your metabolic energy consumption for pedaling? What they suspected here is that an individual's preferred pedaling rate might be explained by the proportions of fast twitch and slow twitch fibers that comprise their muscles. And here they abbreviate that as FT for fast twitch and ST for slow twitch throughout the paper. Slow twitch muscle fibers are generally more efficient than fast twitch fibers, meaning you can produce the same force and the same amount of work with a slow twitch fiber more economically than with a fast twitch fiber, meaning it'll consume less metabolic energy to perform that work. The benefit of the fast twitch fiber then is it can typically perform that work faster. It's typically more powerful and has larger maximum force and larger power and faster shortening velocities and all these things that we typically associate with fast twitch fibers. But for endurance type performance, typically it's the less fatigable, more long-lasting, more efficient slow twitch fibers that we might want. So they suspected here that perhaps the distribution of fiber types in your muscles might explain why some people pick different pedaling rates than other people, and why this could also possibly explain why folks tend to not pick the pedaling rate that is energetically optimal necessarily, that maybe they're optimizing on some other criteria related to their muscle fiber composition here. So to investigate this sensitivity of pedaling rate and pedaling energetics to the fiber composition, they used a computer simulation approach. This was another computer modeling study. Similar to the other computer modeling studies that we've examined, they had a model of the bike and the rider, and then some models of muscle that spanned the joints of the rider. The paper here doesn't have a picture of the model, but it looks pretty much like this. This is a drawing from another conceptually similar model in another study, where it's got the pelvis here, which is kind of representing the whole upper body, and then the thigh and the shank and the foot. The foot is clipped to this pedal here. The pedal connects to this crank, and the crank can rotate around the axis of the bike here along this circular path as the model produces forces with its muscles and moves its legs and presses on this pedal, not this puddle, and produces forces that rotate the crank and generate torque and generate power around the crank. Okay. So this is a model from another study, but it's conceptually similar to the model used in this study. So what they were doing here is they took some measurements of a human subject pedaling on a bike at a constant power output of, I believe, 200 watts. I'm not certain of that. Let me double check here in terms of what the power output was. Yeah, 200 watts was the power output, which is a pretty middle of the road, I would dare say, maybe even low power output for pedaling. Typically, how you quantify like how fit and talented somebody is as a cyclist, if you want to attach like a number to it, you'll calculate a quantity of power in terms of if their power output is 100 watts, 200 watts, 300 watts, and the specifics of that quantity of power will typically be called your FTP, which stands for your functional threshold power. This is a common performance metric in cycling, and this is the crank power that you can sustain on average for 1 hour of pedaling. So the highest power that you could sustain, or the highest average power that you could sustain for an hour. And this is a difficult test. Like at the end of this hour, you would be exhausted essentially. It's pedaling at an aggressive rate for a full hour. It's quite difficult to do when you're actually establishing like a cyclist's FTP, functional threshold power. Sometimes you will actually measure them over a full hour, but there's also other tests you can do that take in the ballpark of like 20 minutes or so. So a more intense but shorter test to estimate your FTP with pretty good accuracy. But that's typically how a cyclist's fitness and performance, at least on the basis of mechanics, in terms of how much power they generate on the crank, is quantified in cycling. So you'll sometimes see it expressed in like absolute watts, like someone's crank power might average 200 watts over an hour. You'll often sometimes see it expressed as that watts divided by the cyclist's body mass. Like let's say a typical mass for a fit cyclist might be like 75 kilograms. Okay, I can't do that math in my head, but 200 over 70 is 2.9 watts per kg. Okay. In terms of gauging like how fit or how talented a cyclist is, any cyclist who's like reasonably well trained with a reasonable level of experience and fitness and not on an awful bike with awful form can probably do an FTP of in the ballpark of like 3 watts per kg. So this would be like, average recreational cyclist kind of level. If your FTP is like in the ballpark of 4, that's going to be your local, very competitive racer. Somebody local, at least in a place with like a decent population and a decent base of talent, that's going to be somebody who's pretty competitive on like the local scene. If your FTP is then like much above 4, like in the 4.5 to 5-ish range or so, that's somebody who's like competitive on the national level, typically, like somebody who could hypothetically be like a national, not necessarily the national champion in like a big country, but somebody who could go to a national level race and not embarrass themselves. They'd be a pretty competitive person. And then if you're much above 5 watts per kg or so, then that's elite. Like that's international competitiveness and your pro cyclist level type of power. Okay. The reason that it's typically expressed as watts per kg body mass and not just watts, if you're pedaling over level ground in cycling, then body mass doesn't really matter that much because you're not working against gravity. Body mass there can actually help you because cyclists who are bigger and heavier tend to have more muscle and can turn the cranks harder and produce more power. But that mass hurts you then when you have to climb uphill and have to move that heavy body mass uphill against gravity. And for any long like race in cycling, with the possible exception of triathlons, which are typically fairly flat courses, but for any like major road race in cycling, there's going to be some serious climbing. And if you're not fairly light, if you can't produce a lot of power while also being fairly light, you're not going to have much of a chance in that race. You'll just have to produce too much power going uphill, and the lighter cyclists, the cyclists who are more powerful, like pound for pound, are just going to smoke a heavier cyclist on a hill. And so that's why this is often expressed as watts per kg in terms of your power. So that was a little bit of a departure there. But this value of 200 watts here, if it's computed for a cyclist with a typical mass of the cyclist plus the bike being like 70, 75, maybe 80 kgs or so, is not a trivial amount of power, but it's something that an average recreational cyclist could probably do and could probably sustain for around an hour or so without a tremendous amount of effort. The calculation here typically for watts per kg, I should clarify one thing. This is typically your power that you produce on the crank divided by your body mass. This is typically excluding the mass of the bike in most situations. I don't think that's always necessarily the case, but typically it's expressed as a crank power divided by body mass of the cyclist themselves, excluding the mass of the bike. Okay, so pretty much average level of power here for a reasonably fit but recreationally active cyclist. So they had an individual pedal on a bike at that power output at pedaling rates of 40, 60, 80, 100, and 120 RPMs. Okay. From that, they got data that they measured for the crank angle, which is basically determined by the pedaling rate, and the torque on the crank. Okay. They then used the computer model here to simulate pedaling at those same five pedaling rates, 40 up to 120 rotations per minute, and optimized the muscle excitations on the model to track the pedaling, the crank angle and crank torque data. And so that looked something like figure 1 down here. This is an example of the measured crank torque data on the left and the crank angle data on the right for the 80 RPM condition. The experimental data is the solid line, so that's the data measured on the human subject, and the dashed line there is the model's performance, the performance of the simulation. So you can see it was able to match the experimentally measured torques and angles with pretty much exact accuracy. Not perfect, but it was essentially the same. Okay, so some confidence there that the model was using crank and pedal kinematics and kinetics that were similar to what an actual human cyclist was using. While it was doing that, they also had the model track these data as close as possible with minimum metabolic energy expenditure. So finding the combination of muscle excitations here that caused this crank to rotate at the target rate, say 40 RPMs, 60 RPMs, 80 RPMs, whatever, with the measured crank torque, so tracking that crank torque as closely as possible, using the minimum amount or the minimum possible amount of metabolic energy expenditure. Okay? And so that's one reason why when you look at these graphs here, you can see the simulation tracks the crank torque and the crank angle almost exactly, but not quite exactly. In spots it's off by like a few Newton meters of torque or a few degrees on the angle. It doesn't track it perfectly because if it had tried to do that perfectly, it would have incurred an excessive metabolic cost. Okay, so what it's trying to do here with the simulations is kind of this trade-off between track these data as close as you can, but do it with minimum metabolic energy expenditure. So don't try and track it so close that you send your metabolic rate sky high trying to get these terms right on top of each other. For some validity in terms of how the simulation did there, like if that's a valid way to simulate pedaling, on the right here shows the rates of metabolic energy expenditure in the simulations. FT here was one set of simulations, and ST here was another set of simulations. I'll explain what those are in a second. Those boxes and those circles here were the metabolic rates of the simulation in terms of the metabolic energy consumed by the models of the muscle in the larger musculoskeletal model. The dots here, the little smaller black dots, are data from a large number of experiments that measured human cyclist metabolic energy expenditure when actual humans pedaled at different cadences. And so you can see here that the simulations were at least in the ballpark of the measured or previously measured human metabolic rates when pedaling at these different rates. So giving some confidence that not only were these like mechanically realistic simulations, but they were also energetically realistic simulations. So then what were they doing here exactly? Getting back to this fiber type stuff. The benefit, again, of using a computer model like this is you can change things and manipulate things in the model that you can't do in a human subject. And so what they did here was they generated one version of the model that had parameters of its muscles representing a high fraction of slow twitch fibers. That's these circles here on the bottom curve. And then another version of the model that had a high fraction of fast twitch fibers and fewer slow twitch fibers. That's these box-shaped data points up here. So repeating those simulations at those 5 different cadences, tracking the measured crank torque and pedal angle data with minimum metabolic energy expenditure. First, doing all 5 of those with a model that had predominantly slow twitch muscle fibers, and then repeating those same simulations again and repeating the optimizations again with a model that was identical but just had larger fractions of fast twitch fibers rather than slow twitch fibers in its muscles. This is a great use of a computer model because in humans we can't control those things, right? I can't go into an individual and snap my fingers and magically give them more fast twitch fibers. I could measure these data on, say, a large number of individuals, like athletes of different backgrounds and different training levels, and then after the fact kind of correlate these things with their fiber composition. That would be one way of doing a similar thing like this experimentally with experiments on human subjects. The difficulty there is that determining accurate fiber compositions in human muscles is invasive. You do something called a muscle biopsy, which involves sticking this big old needle into muscles and literally ripping out a chunk of it. Most people don't want to do research like that a lot of the time. It's difficult to get people to volunteer for it. Or even if you can do that, it's typically limited to measuring it from like one muscle or maybe 2 muscles if you're lucky. You're not going to measure it from all muscles throughout the lower limb for sure, like you're able to do in a model like this. You could also do a similar thing with like a training study where maybe we put people on a training program intended to increase their fast twitch fiber composition, and then we would measure them before and after their training program. That again would be a much more difficult study to do. It's difficult to implement training programs like that. It's difficult to have confidence that it's actually going to achieve the effect ahead of time that you desire to see after the training, and it's just a much more logistically complicated study to control and to execute. So this is a great example of a nice, well-designed computer simulation study tackling a question that's meaningful to live humans but is difficult to execute in live humans. So what did they see here? Take-home messages are down here in figures 4 and in figures 5. Figure 4 is the rate of metabolic energy consumption when the model had mostly fast twitch fibers on the left versus mostly slow twitch fibers on the right. Okay? On the y-axis here is the rate of energy expenditure, and on the x-axis here is the pedaling rate, 40 to 60, 80, 100, 120 RPMs. Okay. The dark shaded portion of the bars here is what's called the net metabolic rate. This is just the metabolic rate of the muscles of the leg. And the chunk here that's lighter colored and tacked onto the top of the leg muscles metabolic rate is what they call the rest of body metabolic rate. This will typically be referred to as like the basal metabolic rate or the resting metabolic rate. This would be things like the energy that your muscles expend, whether they're active or not, like the resting tone of muscle, or the metabolic energy that you expend for using systems of the body other than the muscular system. The metabolic energy it takes to like keep other important systems of the body active that are essential to exercise and to living. So basically just everything that consumes metabolic energy during exercise other than the leg muscles themselves. So you can see here, if you look at the overall height of all of these bars, that in both cases, when it was the fast twitch model versus the slow twitch model, the 60 RPM cadence was the one that minimized the rate of metabolic energy expenditure. But if we look just at the metabolic energy expenditure of the muscles, which is just the darker shaded parts of these bars, for the fast twitch model, the lowest rate of muscle energy expenditure was at 100 RPMs. And for the slow twitch model, the lowest rate of energy expenditure was at 60 RPMs. Okay? So they are possibly explaining why we see some variance from person to person in what preferred pedaling rate is. Maybe folks with more fast twitch fibers prefer relatively fast pedaling rates because that's what minimizes their rate of muscle energy expenditure. And maybe folks with more slow twitch fibers prefer slower pedaling rates because that's what minimizes their muscle energy expenditure. The other interesting piece here is figure 5, where here they calculated efficiency, but it's a little bit different definition of efficiency than we've been working with previously in the cycling section of class. Previously, we defined efficiency as the power output on the crank divided by the metabolic energy consumption of the body. Here, they defined efficiency in a different way. They defined it as the work performed by the muscles, whether or not it resulted in crank power. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Divided by the metabolic energy consumed by the muscles. Okay? So rather than crank power divided by whole body metabolic energy expenditure, here they defined efficiency as the work that the muscles did divided by the metabolic energy that the muscles consumed in performing that work, whether or not it involved crank power or not. Okay? And here they saw that for the slow twitch model, for the model with predominantly slow twitch fibers, the most efficient cadence was 60 RPMs. And again, for the fast twitch model, the most efficient cadence was 100 RPMs. Okay? So again here, some suggestions on why people may tend to prefer different pedaling rates, and possibly why overall people might prefer pedaling rates that differ from the pedaling rate that minimizes the whole body metabolic energy expenditure, which appears to be, at least in these simulations and in other studies, far slower than like the 80 to 100 pedaling rates that people kind of naturally pick. Those in these simulations and in measurements on human subjects, those faster pedaling rates pretty clearly do not minimize metabolic energy consumption in terms of the whole body metabolic energy consumption, but they may minimize, depending on your fiber composition, they may minimize the rate of muscle energy consumption, and they may also maximize, again, depending on your fiber composition, may help to maximize or at least improve the efficiency of those actions of the muscles. Okay? So if you want to know whether somebody might have a certain preferred pedaling rate, or whether if they're pedaling at a rate that is good for them or not, examining their composition of muscle fibers may give you some insights there. That's not terribly helpful like training advice, because outside of like having an exercise physiology lab with like trained experts in using the equipment and the tests involved, determining someone's fiber composition of their muscles is not a real accessible step for somebody to do. But this could again offer some guidance on, should we be trying to change individuals' pedaling rates? Should we be trying to get everybody to pedal at, say, a cadence of 60 RPMs rather than like 80 to 100 RPMs? Would that be beneficial? For minimizing the rate of energy expenditure, yeah, that might be beneficial, but it could end up costing you in terms of muscle energy expenditure, or could cost you in terms of efficiency. And which one is more important for performance in cycling? Difficult question, might depend on the race, might depend on the person. Based on some of the arguments that I made, not in the video from last time, but on the comments on the course website from last time, I would argue that in cycling compared to something like running, maybe this whole body energy expenditure is not quite as important in cycling in terms of a performance metric as it is for running, based on some differences there in terms of the distance of the race and the importance of comfort and the ability to, or feasibility of doing substantial refueling during the race. Okay, that is it for today.